So welcome to the LaRouche Political Action Committee Strategic Overview for December 5th, 2022. I'm Benjamin Deniston. I'm joined today by Michael Steger, and we're looking forward to an opening discussion by Michael Steger and then a discussion with our live Zoom attendees here. If you're watching this on YouTube or somewhere else, you can sign up to participate live at the LaRouche PAC website and join the live Q&A discussion and dialogue section of these calls. So we encourage you to do that. As I'm sure our audience is fully aware, we are in a very exciting political situation inside the United States right now. We're just coming out of a midterm election, and I was talking about it with some colleagues, some friends over the last couple of weeks, and I think it's clear that between the 2016 election, in which we brought Donald Trump into office, the massive kickback of the deep state, the British Empire, the uniparty establishment against Trump trying to implement a America First anti-globalist agenda, the 2020 election, and then this cycle into the 2022 midterms. It's been a heated battle, escalating month to month, year to year, and true American patriots have learned a lot through this process. And we're in a situation now where, despite what some have said that the midterms weren't what they expected or what they wanted, and despite the continued attacks against Trump and the continued attacks against what he represents as a patriotic, pro America anti-globalist faction in the United States, we are still in an incredibly good situation to continue to wage this fight and to win, because people have become battle tested. And I believe the battle lines, the clarity of the issues we're actually fighting for, has really been made clearer and more upfront than it has been in a long time, due to how the enemy has had to react to the fights that we've waged, the fights that Donald Trump has waged, and expose themselves for more and more to see, what the real battle is. It's not, this party winning against that party and so on, or many of the, populist side issues that get presented. It's, a much deeper fundamental fight about what the mission of our nation is and what it means to be a true republic that intends to uplift and develop the entirety of its population. So, if you're still a little disparaged from the midterms, don't be. This is a great situation we're in, really. And I know Mike's got a lot to say, so we'll just jump over to Mike, get his thoughts, and then we look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Ben. So I think what Ben said is really important. Appreciate people getting on these discussions every week. And for those on YouTube, Rumble, get on live and join the discussion. Because in some sense, the challenge we have in front of us is both the challenge and the opportunity are perhaps the most substantial aspects of any of our lives. So as Ben said it, though the midterms had a certain, you might say, a confused result, it wasn't really that surprising when you look at the factors going into this whole situation. But it's hard not to say for anybody in this country, or even in the entire world, to say that the political discourse around basic questions of a true representative government, and in our case, a very clearly constitutional republic, and the requirements and responsibilities of a representative government have not drastically shifted, both in terms of the battle, the enemy, and the intended outcome, the desired outcome of actual changes in policy that hasn't drastically changed over the last 6 years. And to some degree, the number of people who are now willing to dedicate themselves to an all-out political fight, perhaps still in too limited of terms, but that has also grown massively. We've said many times, COVID, November 3rd, other things have added to a sense that sitting back and cheerleading, supporting a certain policy, supporting a certain party doesn't function. And more people have gathered that. But I think if we look at the last week, and this continues to unfold, apparently the attorney generals from Missouri and Louisiana have deposed an FBI officer from San Francisco, FBI agent Chan. And what's unfolded is an ongoing story, much like you saw from the Twitter files, if you followed this, from Elon Musk and Matt Taibbi. And we have a posting on our website, which you can go to on LaRouche PAC, that gives a kind of a perspective of what this is. What we see clearly, and this is something that if you live anywhere near Silicon Valley, you know quite well, that it's a total revolving door. Working in Silicon Valley for Facebook, for Twitter, for Google, for Microsoft, for any of the big HP, but more so the social media platforms and online software platforms, all of that is integral to working in the Washington, D.C. Beltway. There's almost no difference. As if you think of a revolving door for the Treasury Department and lobbyists for Wall Street, it's a revolving door for all of the intelligence agencies, all of the bureaucrats, to kind of go through these corporations. They get a private paycheck, they get some private world experience, they go network, but it's an intermeshed kind of oligarchical, kind of liberal oligarchical rule. Or you could just say a bureaucracy to manage the population, to control the population. Now, that may be known, but certainly the impact that had on the recent elections has had a different take. And now we're starting to get real pressure, real investigations, real hearings. Even Mark Zuckerberg admitted to what was done on the Hunter Biden laptop story. So the dialogue has shifted. It's shifted on this entire FBI, DOJ, CIA, NSA, all of the three letters, the alphabet soup. But it's a massive police state surveillance program. And it has been adopted. It goes back even to the Reagan-Bush period, and executive orders like 12333, which make it ultimately legal, though unclassified, never classified or never unclassified, but ultimately legal to spy on American citizens. But that was adopted in full now with the full spectrum of the digital online platforms, social media, and cell phone activity, which, as we know, pretty much encompasses almost all of your intellectual, consumer, entertainment, and social interactions, as well as GPS location. So all of that's now constantly monitored, and then we see it now applied to news coverage, news stories, and political debate. But this is not something that just existed because of Donald Trump. This has been an ongoing system. That discussion, and because Trump has been so insistent and persistent to break open this dialogue, it's shifted quite a lot. The same is true even on this financial situation, as much as how this financial system is even organized anymore, you have to wonder. People might remember the company Theranos. Again, back to Silicon Valley in Washington, D.C. Theranos was the company, the woman, I forget her name, Meyer, just got sentenced to so many years in prison for massive fraud, but she was backed up by George Shultz, Kissinger, General Mathis, you name it. Out of the DC big time establishment groupings, she was backed as in terms of investors. Complete fraud, complete and total fraud. the mantra of this entire bureaucracy and establishment has literally become fake it until you make it. And in reality is there's going to be no consummation of this marriage. It's all just fake it. And what's what you see with this, whether it was the housing bubble, we built some houses, we extended a lot of basic infrastructure, much of which will never be able to really be paid for under current economic circumstances. It just created more and more debt. But look at the FTX, and people might have questions on it. By no means are Ben and I experts, but you don't have to be an expert to see what was really unfolding here. Broad daylight Ponzi scheme under a thing called crypto, which is just, it's an interesting idea for a ledger of transactions. Maybe it has some utility in legal services and so on. Ultimately, a question of currency. As anyone who knows Lyndon LaRouche and LaRouche PAC and our commitment to Hamilton, the questions of credit and currency are intimately tied with the responsibility of an institution for the welfare and future posterity of a people. And so you create credit that becomes liquid currency through a process of advancing and developing a society. It's not ever just fiat, the way that the libertarian von Hayek schools attempt to promote. And again, Silicon Valley was built on a von Hayek, Ayn Rand kind of outlook and ideology. Like we need no government. Isn't that ironic? The institution and culture of Silicon Valley, the vibrant entrepreneurial Ayn Randian idea, which said we need no government, has become entirely at the behest and service of this massive government bureaucracy, like Eric Schmidt set up with Google, where instead of Google becoming just a sales platform and an interesting search engine that's kind of cool and functions better than others, they said, look, we don't need to just sell ads. They'll do that. They sell more ads. There's like 3, Amazon, Facebook, and Google dominate the entire internet ad agenda or, economy, market. But Schmidt realized, look, why don't we just collect people's information and then sell that? Well, who's buying all of this? And how many people, and in some sense, it's meant to then not only it's bought, it's private. Companies could use it for their marketing and that could become more effective. Trump used it to some degree on Facebook in 2016 to target people that really would respond to an infrastructure agenda and rebuilding the country. So in some sense, maybe there are clearly usefulness to some of these questions, but to a broad scope, this is all a complete waste of time. And it's just monitoring huge amounts of people. And all of this crypto is the same thing. And the reason people bought into it is not because it's this really great technology. It's because they need a place to build up a Ponzi scheme, to bring in every sucker to throw in their $5 or $5,000. Then you get Gisele Bündchen and Tom Brady and Steph Curry and Super Bowl ads and make it super cool and super, fun and just like drinking Coca-Cola and having Pizza Hut pizza and watching the football game. You're now buying some crypto. It's America, baby. It's called massive brainwashing and operating a culture off of frauds and schemes, and then watching the whole thing just blow up because there's been no accountability for any of these schemes since 1987. Greenspan took over the Fed, and they've been bailing out these kleptomaniacs for 35 years. And some of you on this call may have been swindled by some of these things. The .com, how about Y2K? How about the housing bubble? Maybe swindled, maybe you swindled others in it. How many Americans have been caught up in this stuff? We have not been engaged and functioning. So the main point of Lyndon LaRouche, kind of his last will and testament, you might say, was to be very clear on the 4 laws for a new American economic agenda. And that really is to say this apparatus is bankrupt and it's criminal. This financial which is not separate from this massive surveillance state of control, is entirely criminal and corrupt and based on a fraud of conception of human identity and an outright legal, economic, financial fraud. The Federal Reserve, that largely includes the Federal Reserve, which has made all of these Ponzi schemes increasingly possible because they've just been printing incessant amounts of money. Huge, 6 trillion in the last 2 years. So, so we've got to fundamentally adjust and change and establish an entirely new approach to this entire program. You can't have Bill Binney, who was one of the leading directors of a branch of the National Security Agency, set up a program because he said, look, if you collect everybody's data, even if it's all foreign people, of course, once you're doing that 7.5 billion people, it's not hard to add the other half. You collect it all, you've got nothing to work with. You've got so much material, you're in an ocean of meaningless data. You start with a clear concept. You start with clear targets of individuals. The same is true. Let me put it, and I'm wanting to make a deeper point here about what role we play, we on this call, in this dialogue around LaRouche's ideas, around this Trump campaign at this moment in history, because the dialogue has shifted so much. So this idea of just collecting data on people and selling it, what purpose does this have? It serves zero fundamental interest to anybody. It's a control program. It's like when many of the people when Elon Musk bought Twitter said, we're no longer going to advertise on Twitter. Well, the reason they're advertising on Twitter, to one level, maybe they get some people buying their product. On another level, they may keep their product, their name brand out there in the public view. To a large extent, these things advertise, whether it's in the New York Times, Washington Post, on Twitter, etc., because they're politically subsidizing these propaganda outlets on behalf of the intelligence and globalist program. We get the bailouts, we circle that money back through. It's the same thing with Ukraine. We send money to Ukraine. The Ukraine puts the money back into FTX, and then FTX moves on to bail out a bunch of the Democrats. It's all just a political game of control to keep people from taking the necessary steps, because there's no way all this data. You know, you might watch videos on YouTube or read articles, and people want to prove a point today. I want to prove a point. Many of you might have seen this. Someone wants to make a point, a scientific point on COVID or on cosmology and the Big Bang or whatever scientific conception you're dealing with. They start to pull out academic papers. They want to make a point on gender. They want to make a point on, testosterone levels or whatever, right? There's so many different things out there today. They start pulling out academic papers to prove their point. But we have studies done which show that most academic papers are never truly vetted, they're never replicated, and most of them are just outright wrong or premised on statistical fraud. That is, that researchers want to prove a point, they find a way to prove it, they publish a paper. It means nothing. You're just paying bureaucrats to go to universities to just do research. And all you do is accumulate every possible opinion and perspective is then generating some academic paper that another person then uses to argue their conclusion. But where does this get us? It's spinning wheels. And you get a lot of hand waving saying, but I have a PhD or these people are credentialed, or let's just hope you're so busy and focused on surviving every day, you don't see this broader scheme, because it wasn't just COVID. It wasn't just like these people became, all of a sudden, we didn't realize these people were academic frauds in many ways, or there was a massive boondoggle run through the NIH or something towards a healthcare system that we all know is way overpriced. We spend more per person than any other country, and we have what, the 30th, best healthcare, or 50th best life expectancy. Our infant mortality rate is lower than many countries. It's becoming somewhat absurd. We all know it. So this was LaRouche's point, that this system has to be reorganized. And you have to then give clear physical indications and directions, just like you would if you were running the thin thread program of Bill Binney to look at terrorist networks. You'd pick out clear terrorist groupings and build networks that watch these actual, we can verify physically are terrorists, people engaged in some level of conspiracy to commit harm. And you would see what their networks were and what they were doing. Binney used this to predict a certain shift in Soviet policy at one point. The same is done with an economy. Where do we actually have to take things? Yes, it's not like that should be left up to one person just to have an opinion. We're not an authoritarian state. But it is up to a political deliberation based on reality, based on real requirements for future survival, future productivity, that certain things are going to have to be met. And what LaRouche put into his 4 laws was a driving conception of how you reorganize this system to make that possible. Now, what the financial system has become, he wrote this in 2014. You can find it online. It's fairly easy. It's worth reading, and reading not just the first, 3 or 4 steps, the so-called laws, but the broader conception he presents. But a lot has changed even since this period of time, since 2014. And in terms of how excessively wealth has shifted from the population in the most historically dramatic ways into the hands of a small few. And they're not even banks any longer. They're funds, like the old Venetian fondi, where it's just kind of represented by BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street or other private equity, Cargill, and so on, Citadel. Kind of an oligarchical grouping, but it's not really those individuals who run them. They don't necessarily own the money, but they use the money invested with them to control, like ESG, where you direct everything towards only green, so-called green investments. How do we confront this? So it's a commitment we have to have. And this is what you see with Trump, is that he recognizes we've got to take this level of authority and command. And he's not going to stop fighting. A lot of Americans, even many Republicans and many people that voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020 are wondering, should we really support him? He is the only figure inside the American political landscape that has anywhere near the necessary courage and understanding to attack this very real, deep, severe problem, that if this isn't addressed, that nothing else ultimately can be. That you can rewind much of the other things he might do, like with the Paris Accord and so on. We've got to change the way we are functioning and the direction physically we are going. LaRouche PAC has laid this out. You can get this on our website. Many of you just know it. The nuclear power agenda, the Project Artemis. We are going to get an update on Project Artemis because we've had the first launch. The capsule, the unmanned capsule, is on its return. Its heat shield would be tested, but we're deploying robotics, industrial capabilities. I mean, how many people in this country know we plan on colonizing the moon permanently beginning in 3 years? And by 2030 to have perhaps a permanently manned base, but the footprints of men and women will be on the moon in the coming years as part of an industrial process. So these are the kinds of questions LaRouche PAC, and especially the nuclear power question, reindustrializing, we've been emphasizing. But there's something different than just the policy, isn't there? There's a question of a coherence of commitment that comes out of Trump's leadership that has to come out of more and more Americans. This is what Lyndon LaRouche recognized. This is why how he built the movement over 50 years, was over that quality of leadership in himself and to inspire it in others. And we've got to resonate this quality of commitment because we are in a failed system. And the ability to get into a functioning system, a viable one for future generations, 4 or 5 generations to come, requires breaking from this current outlook and adopting an entirely different kind of orientation. One that's based on a clear sense of a future we're going to build, not see what happens to us, to put it in certain terms. Now, in 1988, Lyndon LaRouche was running for president. He was also under massive federal attack, and that was conjoined by a massive media barrage calling him a neo-Nazi, right-wing, political extremist, Trotskyite, communist, socialist, you name it. And what was presented in this television presidential ad was that the enemy knew, the globalist British system and its proponents knew, LaRouche would only win if there was a great crisis. Well, that crisis wasn't far away. The Soviet Union was going to collapse in a mere couple of years. And LaRouche had actually was directly engaged in that process. The same thing is true today. And they're going to, meaning the globalist networks, will try their damnedest to make sure that this system continues to look like it's somehow functioning and providing some level of survival. But they've got a bigger problem. Russia is on the cusp. It's now getting cold enough. The ground is beginning to freeze in Ukraine. You have to imagine Ukraine's dark black soil can go upwards of 15 feet deep. So when it rains over the late fall period, it can be literally 15 feet of almost like black quicksand, just muddy soil 15 feet deep. This literally has to freeze before anything but roads can be used. That's now happening. Russia has pulled together probably the most advanced army and deployment militarily since World War II, throughout eastern, southern, and potentially northern parts of Ukraine. And they gave the West an opportunity for a dialogue and expressed that they were very serious about the questions of not having Ukraine join NATO, getting rid of the neo-Nazis, having some autonomy for these eastern provinces. Putin has even expressed regret that they didn't do more to defend these provinces in 2014. That we actually he wanted to give some level of good faith to the dialogue that the West was having, but leading figures like Merkel having lately admitted, we never intended, we only wanted to prolong Russia's actions so that Ukraine could build up a viable army. Now, they built up a viable army of a couple of 100,000 well-trained troops, but that's to a large extent been decimated now. So this has been an ongoing conflict for over 8 years, almost 9. But what happens when Russia ends this Ukraine conflict on its own military terms? Unconditionally. Unconditional surrender. What's going to happen to NATO? What's going to happen? You can see this in the actions of Macron. You can see this in the concerns and anxiety of a number of people in Europe. There are ongoing protests in Vienna. in Eastern Germany, as there were in 1989 with candlelight vigils on Monday evenings in places like Leipzig, in Eastern Germany, southeast of Berlin, that they're doing that same thing today every Monday night. Does that not presage the end of this current neoliberal system as it did then 30 years or over 30 years ago, towards the end of the Soviet system? Can NATO survive? Is it worth anything? Do these countries want to continue to remain within NATO? Does that make sense? Has the expansion of NATO since 1989 improved the security of Europe? Or has it only actually endangered these nations to be once again mauled and destroyed by British imperial antics? It will be interesting to see what level of force the populations of these countries decide, because much of that post-war era is gone. The post-war baby boom generation is now increasingly in its 70s. And the predominant people that are going to be making decisions look at this past 75, 80 years since the World War II as not necessarily a success. Can the EU survive? Will nations continue to submit to an EU bureaucracy focused on shutting down all of the industry and energy supply, regardless of what Russia does? Or will they begin to say, look, we have greater capabilities of survival independently, working with Russia, working with China, working with nations in the Middle East, working with nations in Africa? Is it not better to develop Africa rather than have all the Africans move to Europe, as some people are putting it? Is not the same thing true for the United States? Don't we have a greater capability of rapidly developing our own industry and production and energy supply, and then providing that same capability to nations in Central and South America than we do somehow then bringing them in as refugees because of destroyed countries from the narcos and drug cartels? We're really on a cusp of a major point of decision. And I'll just end at this point, that what Trump's campaign represents is something far greater than a Republican Party campaign. In a very real way, this is not a partisan campaign. It's a nonpartisan one. It is, as George Washington addressed and as Bob Ingram addressed in his 10-part Washington class series, it is meant to bring the nation back to becoming for the people in our country to once again become American citizens in terms of the full scope and responsibility of what that means, to pull a nation together, to not take it for granted, and to use it for the great capabilities that such a nation provides. That's what this is a movement. And it will require grassroots. It will require at least a party structure to behave, to not undercut it. But it's going to have to encompass a far more universal question of what are we as a people, as a nation, than merely, what you might think of normally as politics. That question, that burden or opportunity lies, I believe, on our shoulders more than anyone else's because of the access to Lynn's ideas. So I'll leave my comments there, Ben. Maybe you have some thoughts to respond, and then I guess we can see what people are thinking.